Okay, well, we're back with Louis Venters and Layli Maparyan. Welcome back, guys. Let's pick up where we left off. Louis?
Sure, sure. Um, so I guess the question where we left off was, the structures, as Layli alluded to earlier in our talk, community building, right? Expressions of belief and desire to create the kingdom of God on earth don't instantaneously mean that the kingdom is here, right? That there's a building process. And so the way the House of Justice, the Universal House of Justice, has explained this relatively recently is that there's this period of several decades where Baha'is in South Carolina, other places in the Deep South and around the United States are in the same kind of experimentation that's happening in many other parts of the world where larger scale growth of the Baha'i Faith took place. So the 60s, 70s, and 80s is this particularly rich period for the worldwide Baha'i community in which people tried everything, every method under the sun of raising up more and more individuals as teachers and administrators of the Baha'i Faith. Every method possible for educating the children of the community in the Baha'i teachings. Every possible method of deepening the understanding of adults and youth, all kinds of study materials, every possible kind of program, a blossoming of artistic expression. We were in the interlude and at the very beginning of our talk, there were some recordings, some songs that we were listening to that I imagine took Layli at least back, right? Because when you were a kid, you must have heard all that as your parents took you around here and there. Layli's parents were kind of movers and shakers in this movement in the 70s. And so ways of conveying the teachings and the history of the faith through song, through drama, through art, different kinds of radio programs, television programs in South Carolina and several other places in the Americas and one country in Africa. The establishment of Baha'i-run community service radio stations. So there's this period of experimentation, trial and error. How do we get more people involved? How does the community transform itself? What does this look like in all different kinds of circumstances around the world? And South Carolina was intimately involved in this process. And I want to say that hundreds or thousands of people really rose up as active protagonists of this Baha'i community vision. It was fewer than I think anybody wanted at the outset of the program in 1970. But it was a huge step forward for the American Baha'i community as Southern African Americans from rural places moved into the forefront of the learning in the Baha'i world. That is a world-shaking event, a world-shaking process, right? As the gifts, spiritual and intellectual and cultural of Southern African Americans made their way into the American Baha'i community's concept of itself, into the practice of the American Baha'i community. It's a different and better place now than it was before this large-scale growth in South Carolina started. There were people who spent years of their lives visiting Baha'is in rural places, um, um, writing to each other, training groups of Baha'is in various kinds of circumstances, helping foster the growth, the development of local spiritual assemblies, these local units of governance in towns and hamlets. The kind of effort that was put into this community building process in South Carolina and other deep South states, I think we ought to own it. I think we ought to be proud of it. I think we ought to be realistic about it, right? Is the kingdom of God on earth here this moment? I mean, in practical terms, no. There's still more to do, right? Has the Training Institute process has it borne all of the fruit that it will, even in South Carolina, that helped give birth to it? No. There's still more. I think there's one thing I would take from the spirit of experimentation of the 70s and 80s is audacity. I think that's one thing that Baha'is of the current generation can really draw as inspiration from this South Carolina story, is that these were groups of folk who set out to do huge things with very limited resources. They did not accomplish everything that they set out to do, but they sure did more than lots of other places in the American Baha'i community around the United States. They made a big difference, and did it with that long game in mind, right? Knowing what the big picture is, and knowing that if it's the will of God for all this to be done, then we have to step out on faith. We have to hold each other up and commit to changing our lives and the life of the world, right? So these folks, who became Baha'is in the 70s and helped push this program along are these quiet heroes in the American nation. That we need to know them and love them and honor them, and that's one of the reasons that I'm so happy that this new book that just came out year before last, because it's so many pictures. It made me so happy that a new generation of American Baha'is get to see the faces, the radiant faces of these South Carolinians who decided they were just going to change the world today. And the joy that comes across in a lot of these photographs, I think really is transformative. They say a picture's worth 1,000 words, and it's kind of trite, but it really is. I want to introduce the South Carolina Baha'i community to the general public, and kind of reintroduce it to American Baha'is.
You don't really understand the history we're living at the moment, isn't that right?
Well, but that's probably the case of every generation of Baha'is in the United States.
Of everybody.
Probably everybody, right? We've been so busy, trying to make history that we don't always remember exactly where we fit, right? And I think that is one thing that is an advantage of the Baha'i system, right? Is that source of guidance at the Baha'i World Center is constantly reminding everybody what their little tiny contributions mean in the grand scheme of things, and it makes a difference.
Well, in your work, it brings it to that level of attention. I think we've been talking about this, but Layli, I know you pinged me on this one question about what's happened to these thousands and thousands of Baha'is that became Baha'is, African American mostly, in that time period. What are your thoughts on that?
I think I would just be reporting on what Louis talked about in his book, although, as you mentioned, as a young person, I was sort of on the sidelines watching some of these things. But, when the large number of people became Baha'is, they were very excited about becoming part of a community that was going to build this new world. And what the Baha'i community discovered is that there wasn't a single way to bring everybody into common participation. And, as Louis mentioned, over time, we developed the Training Institute as a way. And so, there were times when those communities were more active, and there were times when those communities were less active. There were times when those communities were helping evolve this new understanding about process that we have. I mean, one of the points that I wanted to make in reference to the conversation that the two of you were just having is that one of the understandings of the worldwide Baha'i community is that if you truly are going to build another structure, if that structure is going to be, whether you want to call it, the kingdom of God on earth, whether you want to call it the world order Baha'u'llah, whether you want to call it an ever-advancing civilization, whatever name you want to use, that structure is essentially a new pattern of life. And you see that phrase, a new pattern of life, over and over in the guidance of the Baha'i Faith, because it's reflecting the fact that we are causing human beings, we ourselves are embracing new ways of being in the world. Everything from new ideas about how to spend our time to new ideas about how we move about in space, to new ideas to how we interrelate, and the Training Institute study circles and different kinds of groups and organizations help us do that. I mean, they begin, for example, by inviting everyone to embrace the fact that we're spiritual beings and that the life of the spirit is actually our true identity and our true purpose, and then inviting us to understand that we all have the ability to communicate with God through prayer, and that God communicates us through the divine educators. And then making us think about the bigger realm of life and death and what that means for our daily lives, and then moving from there to understanding the role of service in holding our communities together and understanding the kind of principles that are going to build this new world. And so there's this whole idea about a new pattern of life being built, being sustained, being embraced, being radically inclusive of everyone. So I think that our friends in South Carolina have been a big part of helping us learn how to achieve a new pattern of life and what that new pattern looks like when we are radically inclusive.
Just to follow on that, in the American Baha'i community today, there's, how shall I say this? South Carolina kind of looms large in our identity and memory, but there's a lot of different understandings of what this Deep South experience has meant, and because the consolidation efforts were a lot harder than anybody initially realized, there was a period in the 80s and 90s when I would say the American Baha'i movement cooled to the idea of this large-scale growth, at least not so much among rural African Americans. That's a good long story, and I think kind of difficult to talk about still for a lot of American Baha'is today. There's a lot more to be explored. Some of it is in the book, but I think there's still a lot of digging and a lot of coming to terms with this experience of the 70s and 80s. Just before the House of Justice told us in the 1990s how to breathe fresh life into large-scale growth through the Training Institute process.
One of the questions we have, and I think you could both speak to, and we should give some thought to, is if we've considered having folks from any of these various periods come and share stories. And I know we we have Kathy Lee on the call. I noticed her name, and she is, in fact, we had a program coming, but because of some health issues, it's needing to be postponed. And Layli, you've been working on it as well. You know, I wonder if there are a couple of stories that you might share, and we should be thinking about, this way we get you all back again, by the way, we should be thinking about, you know, curating some of this, because I think it's, a lot of people are writing here. I think it's important, and it's wonderful the light that you bring to it in your work.
I did some oral interviews a couple of years ago. I was on sabbatical from my university, and I'm trying to write a sequel, a full-length sequel to No Jim Crow Church that would tell as many of these stories as possible from the late 1960s on. And so as a part of that project, I was doing some oral interviews, and I was in the town where I happened to go to college for my undergraduate degree. And we were addressing this question of, oh, there's this explosion in the 1970s, and then, you know, a lot of communities, things kind of went down, and so what do we understand about this? And one of the guys I was interviewing was a youth in 1971 and became a Baha'i as a part of this process, and he was not the most reputable character in his community, shall we say, and underwent a real transformation as part of his association with the Baha'is. And when I posed this question to him, what do we understand about what happened here? Where are all these Baha'is? He said, they're everywhere. They may not show up at this or that meeting, but they're all here. They're all transformed because of this experience. And the way he put it then, as he continued to explain this, and I found it arresting, he said, can you imagine how many more African-American men would have spent years in jail in Rock Hill, South Carolina, had it not been for the influence of the Baha'i community when it arrived here? He elaborated on this, and his point was, we have to think about the Baha'i faith as more than just a religion that just has a list of members, right? And then there's this church and that church, and, you know, everybody has their members, right? We have to think of the Baha'i faith as a movement that is penetrating the heart of people and transforming the lives of people, and it belongs to everybody who encounters it, right? So I think to this point, this question about, you know, where are the Baha'is in South Carolina now? They are all over the place. Their children and grandchildren are all over the place. And the more we've been able to bring the new training institute system to some of these communities that experienced large-scale growth in the 70s and the 80s, the receptivity of people, the interest of South Carolinians in moving this process forward is, I think, not any less than it was in 1970, maybe more. And we found that the grandkids of the ones who became Baha'is in 1971 are the first ones to show up when we knock on the door. So I think there's still vastly more to do, and now the whole American Baha'i community with deploying this system everywhere is we're developing a unified language for how to talk about, for how to analyze these processes as we're engaged in them. And so now I think the South Carolina community can really come into its own with the rest of the country in pushing it all forward.
And again, I think it's important for us to be honest and with integrity and be sincere that with all the warts and everything else, this process moves forward. It's a long, thorny road, but I think what you said before about the struggle, the struggle itself is quite informative. I've got a question here from someone who says that a friend that introduced them to the Baha'i Faith told them that we're not allowed to be missionaries or to proselytize. And you were talking about the door to door. And so just kind of put that into context a little bit for us.
Sure, sure. So, when you say missionary, right, the idea is, somebody who is, freed up to go someplace else, who draws a salary, and has an official position as a teacher of the word, right? And there's not that special category of people within the Baha'i community, right? Because there's no clergy or really much of anything like clergy in the structure of the Baha'i community. All the believers are on an equal footing, right? But that doesn't mean that we don't have plans and systems for how to geographically grow the Baha'i community in more and more places, and how to foster this process of community development that we're talking about in locality after locality. And sometimes it does mean somebody picking up from where they live and going to live somewhere else. But it's not with any special status or authority in the community.
Or payment.
What?
Or payment.
Or yeah. It's not a way to get rich. Let me assure you. It's service, and the point is really that if there's any distinction between the one who moves in and the people who are native to the place, it's erased very, very quickly with the salve of the Holy Spirit and the writings of Baha'u'llah, right? So that's the missionary question. And proselytizing, as I understand it, that prohibition is on bringing any kind of coercion to bear in the process of sharing the word. Even a hint of emotional, psychological, any kind of manipulation or insistence is prohibited, right? But that doesn't mean that Baha'is don't make it a point to share the message with others in whatever way is culturally appropriate to their environment. And in rural South Carolina, out in tiny hamlets, the only way you can talk to some people is to go out and follow the dirt country road to get to their house and see if they're home, right? So going to where the people are seemed perfectly reasonable at the time, and has been quite useful. But there's different methods that Baha'i communities use to get the word out to more and more people, and it really depends on the community and what the conventions are in any particular place. But for rural people in South Carolina, at that time at least, right, a lot has changed since then. But having somebody come visit and set up on your porch and snap some green beans with you and talk about important things, I mean, you're welcome to come, right? And in fact, there's so many stories. Maybe we talked about this last week. So many stories of people who were waiting for the Baha'is to come, right, to their door, who said that they had a dream the night before that somebody was going to come with a message. So that's not proselytizing. That's just doing what you got to do to find the people who are receptive, right?
Well, and of course, one of the main principles is independent investigation of truth, which is really the antithesis. And I'd like to direct that to you, Layli. Talk a little bit about this whole idea of independent investigation of truth and its sort of impact, even psychologically?
I mean, I think that when you look at the history of world religions, the Baha'i Faith is distinctive in not having a clergy. And as we talked about earlier, we operate with administratively through elected councils, but each person is responsible for their own spiritual journey, their own spiritual development. And we are all charged with engaging the scriptures for ourselves, with our own prayer, with our own reflection on our lives, bringing ourselves to account each day. And we're also charged with all of the forms of service that sustain communities. We're also charged with teaching the faith. And, while Louis pointed out that that doesn't mean proselytizing, it does mean sharing with others what we know and believe, and letting people know that we understand that a new divine educator has come to unify the planet, and invite people to be a part of that if they so desire. I mean, because if we don't share it, people may not know about it. And if the world is to come together, people need to be invited to be a part of that purpose. To some extent, those things will happen naturally, but to other extents, it requires our, volition and action. And so the independent investigation of truth is sort of the corollary, insofar as we afford the dignity of knowledge to every person. We understand that every person is born a noble human being with the capacity to know God and grow spiritually. And, we like to support that in one another and in ourselves to develop it.
Well, it truly is a new day. I cannot thank you both enough. I know how busy your schedules are, both of you, for being with us today. Again, so excited that you'll be back in March. I think it's March 27th. Check our website for this extraordinary Louis Gregory's life and times, and the museum and so forth. Next week, or next session, 2 weeks hence, we will have a discussion with the filmmakers of the Nasrin documentary that's just being released. And I'd like to also just say, those of you who might have attended the chat, we had some more questions, who might not be connected with the Baha'i, we have a program. You could just send an email to info@baha'i.chat, and in the subject line, write guide, and we can connect you on a one-on-one basis with someone who could maybe help open the door to your own independent investigation of truth, and we'd be happy to provide that as well. Thank you to everyone for being with us.